Sometimes on our spiritual journey, it's easy to believe that spiritual experiences are the goal of the journey. Hey, everybody, thank you so much for joining me. Yes, spiritual experiences where we have a deep connection in a moment. It could be in a time of worship, it could be a vision, it could be a dream, where we sense that we are connected very closely to Jesus is an amazing experience. But the goal of the journey is to know Jesus more. In Acts 10, 9 through 23a, we see that Peter is given a vision by God. And this vision doesn't make sense to him. And as a result, we come to our theme for today, which is entitled Vision, Vulnerability. Vision, Vulnerability. Vision vulnerability is basically when you have an amazing spiritual experience, but you don't wait for the interpretation of what God is trying to show you in the moment. It can make us vulnerable when we have a high experience with very little understanding or interpretation of what God is trying to show us. In verse 17, it says, while Peter was wondering about the meaning of the vision. Yes, Peter was confused. He's like, I don't understand the interpretation of what Jesus just showed me in this vision. In this moment, he's vulnerable because he could easily draw his own conclusion about what he feels that he needs to do next. But instead of running ahead with his own interpretation, he goes through a simple process that every single one of us need to go through when we have a spiritual experience. First, he continued to listen to the Spirit of God. In verses 19 through 20, the Spirit of God is still telling him what he needs to do. Then in verse 23b, we see two steps that Peter takes in understanding the interpretation of the vision that he has been given. Here's what the verse says. It says, the next day, Peter started out with them, the men that came from Cornelius to bring him back to Cornelius' household, and some of the believers from Joppa went along. The second step is that Peter simply took the next step that was in front of him. These men said, hey, you need to come. The Spirit said, yes, you do need to go. So he went in obedience and simply took the next step. Yes, we would like to see the whole big picture of what God is doing, but many times he simply reveals the next step to us, which leads us eventually to the interpretation of what he's trying to show us. The third step that Peter took is that he included his community in the interpretation. When he went to Cornelius' house, it says later that he took 6 brothers with him. He included the community in the interpretation of what the vision was all about. For every single one of us, when we have experiences spiritually, let's not jump ahead with our own interpretation of what we think it means. Rather, continue to listen to the Spirit, take the next step in front of us, and include the community. I know for me, I've had spiritual experiences in the past where I was inspired, but I didn't wait for the interpretation of what God was trying to show me. As a result, I screwed some things up, had to ask for God's forgiveness, and be reminded that just because you're inspired doesn't mean you always have the interpretation. But rather, going through the process that we've talked about, God will eventually show you the interpretation for what He is showing you. Which brings us to our question for today. Have you asked for interpretation, not just inspiration? The question is saying, hey, yeah, we all want to have spiritual experiences. We want to know God more, but have you asked for the interpretation of what those experiences mean? And if you haven't, I would encourage you to slow down, continue to listen to the Spirit, take the next step, and involve your community in the vision or the experience that God showed you. Let's allow God to turn our visions not into an opportunity for vulnerability where the enemy can cause confusion and destruction. Rather, let's see God use these visions to bring us victory as we wait for His interpretation. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a blessed day.